A story worth telling. Dear friend, settle in while I share something that happened in Wyoming Territory back in 1881. My grandmother knew this woman personally, saw her work with her own eyes, felt the fabric between her fingers. Now, most folks today don't understand what it meant to be different back then, especially for a woman who couldn't hear. But Vera Hayes, bless her heart, she taught us all something about the worth of a person's hands and the blindness of those who can see. This isn't a tale of pity, mind you. It's about finding treasure where others see trash, about how the good Lord sometimes closes one door only to open a window you never knew existed. So pour yourself some coffee and let me tell you about the day everything changed. Now, picture this March morning, 1881, cold enough that breath hung in the air like pipe smoke. Vera Hayes crouched behind the Hartley Ranch sorting barn, her fingers deep in a pile of black wool that everyone else had walked past like it was manure. The ranch hands had been laughing she couldn't hear them, but she felt their boots stomping on the barn floor above, felt it right through the frozen ground. Jake Brennan, the foreman, had just kicked that wool aside with his muddy boot. Same way you'd kick a dead cat off your porch. But Vera's fingers, they knew something different. That black wool, Lord have mercy, it had oils in it the white wool didn't carry. Rich as butter, smooth as fresh cream. Her mother, God rest her soul, had taught her to feel quality in fabric before the fever took Vera's hearing at 15. Good wool tells its story through your fingers, Mama used to say, back when they'd walk through the general store feeling bolts of calico and muslin. The other women at Mrs. Palmer's boarding house had warned her, writing on that little slate, "Brennan's mean as a snake. Stay clear." But $2.40 don't last long, and the shed she'd been sleeping in now had a padlock on it. The owner wanted his space back for spring planting supplies. She dragged those grain sacks through the mud, 30 pounds each if they were an ounce. Not a soul offered to help. Through the barn's open door, she watched Brennan counting out coins for the white wool. $2 a bag, sometimes 3 if the quality was prime. The black wool, he'd told his men to burn it later, contaminates the good stuff, he'd said, though Vera read his lips clear as day. Back at the abandoned smokehouse, old man Garrett had left to rot. Vera spread her treasure on the dirt floor. The morning sun slanted through the broken boards, and dust motes danced like tiny angels in the light. She pulled out her mother's thimble, sterling silver, with her initials worn smooth. H. Vera Catherine Hayes, same as her daughter. It was worth maybe $2 at the pawn shop, but she'd starve before she'd sell it. That smokehouse still smelled of hickory and old meat, but it was dry and nobody bothered her there. She'd made herself a bed of hay borrowed from the livery stable well. Borrowed was a kind word for it. The stable boy had pretended not to see when she'd stuffed it in a flour sack one evening. The first fleece she examined told her everything. As her fingers worked through the matted sections, she found what others couldn't see. The black wasn't uniform at all. There were shades in there, like looking at the night sky, charcoal near the sheepskin, true black in the middle, and storm cloud gray at the tips. Each shade felt different, held different amounts of that natural oil shepherds call lanolin. Waste not, want not, her grandmother always said. And here was proof treasure in what others called trash. She needed water to wash it proper. The creek behind the smokehouse ran fast with snowmelt, cold enough to make your bones ache. But clean wool was the start of everything. She found a rusted bucket with only 2 holes in it, nothing a little pine pitch couldn't fix. 6 trips to that creek, fingers going from red to white to blue. The first washing revealed something remarkable, unlike white wool that clumped and matted when wet. This black wool kept its character. Each fiber stayed separate, like they were too proud to tangle with their neighbors. By the time the noon sun hit, she'd rigged up a carding system from broken curry combs she'd pulled from the stable's trash heap. The stable boy, Tommy was his name, had watched her with eyes full of pity and disgust mixed together. She knew that look, seen it her whole life since the fever. But alone in that smokehouse, with her hands working the wool, those looks couldn't touch her. The curry combs weren't ideal too far apart, meant for horses, not wool, but she made do. A little leather from an old harness to create tension, and she had something workable. The first thread that emerged from her fingers wasn't pretty, lumpy in places, too thin in others. But when she pulled it, really pulled with all her might, it held, stronger than any thread she'd made from white wool back when she could afford to buy fleece. It was then, testing that ugly but strong thread, that Adelaide Morrison appeared in the smokehouse doorway. The shopkeeper's wife stood there in her good black dress, her face unreadable in the backlight. She held up a piece of paper and wrote 4 words that changed everything. I saw him wasted. Before we continue, please leave a like and subscribe. Let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Adelaide Morrison stepped into that smokehouse like she owned it, though I could tell by the way her hand touched the doorframe that she'd never been in such a place. Her fingers came away black with soot. She wiped them on her handkerchief, Irish linen, the kind that cost more than Vera made in a month back when she could still get work. Now, Adelaide had a peculiar way about her. Her husband was sheriff, sure enough, but Adelaide herself had come from Massachusetts money. You could see it in how she held her shoulders, straight as a rifle barrel, despite the arthritis that had twisted her fingers into bird claws. She pulled out another piece of paper from her handbag, good paper, cream-colored with a watermark. Her pencil moved quick. "Show me what you're doing with that wool." Vera's hands tightened on the thread she'd been spinning. Trust came hard when you'd been run out of every shop in town, but Adelaide just stood there, waiting, her gray eyes steady as stone. The older woman walked closer, her button boots clicking on the packed dirt floor. She touched the curry comb contraption Vera had rigged up, ran her bent fingers along the leather straps. Then she saw the thread, that ugly, strung thread, and picked it up. What happened next? Well, you had to see it to believe it. Adelaide pulled out a pair of reading spectacles from her bag and examined that thread like it was spun gold. She held it to the light streaming through the broken boards. She tested it between her fingers, pulled it hard enough that her knuckles went white. Then she wrote, "This is better than what comes from Denver." The pencil kept moving. "I need black fabric for morning clothes. Good black that won't fade, won't show salt stains from tears." Vera's stomach clenched. She pointed at her makeshift tools, at the pile of unwashed wool. How could she make fabric with this? Adelaide wasn't done writing, "I have a spinning wheel, my mother's from Massachusetts, and a loom in my storeroom, gathering dust since my hands got bad." She pulled something else from her bag, a key, iron, heavy, with a number stamped on it, 302. The address of her shop on Main Street. "Tonight," she wrote, "after the store closes, come to the back door." But then Adelaide's face changed. Through the smokehouse door, Vera felt the vibration of horses approaching, multiple horses, moving fast. Adelaide grabbed Vera's arm, and her mouth formed one word that Vera could read clear as day, "Brennan." Adelaide pushed Vera behind the door, her arthritic fingers stronger than they looked. Through the gaps in the smokehouse walls, dust kicked up in clouds. 3 horses, Brennan on his bay gelding, and 2 ranch hands. Vera recognized the Collins boys, mean as their daddy before them. Adelaide stepped outside before they could dismount. Now, you have to understand, Adelaide Morrison might have been 62 years old with her hands bent like winter branches, but she had something most folks didn't. She had position. Her husband wasn't just sheriff. He was Sheriff Morrison, the man who'd brought in the younger gang member that tried to rob the bank in 7. Brennan stayed on his horse, looking down at Adelaide. His mouth moved, and though Vera couldn't hear the words, she could see Adelaide's spine go even straighter, if that was possible. The older woman pulled out a small notebook, the kind Sheriff Morrison used for taking statements, and wrote something down. She showed it to Brennan. His face went the color of raw beef. He pointed at the smokehouse, right at the gap where Vera was watching. Adelaide stepped sideways, blocking his view. She held up that notebook again, and this time she pointed at the sheriff's office, visible down the street. The Collins boys looked at each other. The younger one, Pete, started to dismount, but Brennan held up his hand. His mouth formed words Vera could read. "This isn't over." They rode off, but slow, like they wanted Adelaide to know they weren't scared, just choosing to leave. Adelaide came back inside, her face pale but set. She wrote, "Pack everything. Now they'll be back." Vera's hands moved fast, gathering the wool, the curry combs, her mother's thimble. Everything she owned fit in 2 grain sacks and a flour bag. Adelaide helped, her bent fingers surprisingly quick at sorting the cleaned wool from the dirty. "Leave it all here," Adelaide wrote. "I'll send my husband's deputy for it." But Vera shook her head and pointed at the wool. This was everything. Adelaide's mouth tightened, but she nodded. They waited until dusk, that time when honest folks were home for supper and the streets emptied out. Adelaide led the way, Vera dragging those grain sacks behind her. They didn't go down Main Street. Adelaide knew the back ways, through the alleys where Chinese laundresses hung sheets and the smell of lye soap burned your nose. The back door of Adelaide's shop opened into a storeroom that smelled of cedar and lavender. Bolts of fabric lined the walls, calico, muslin, wool from back east. And there in the corner, covered with a dust sheet, sat the promised spinning wheel. Adelaide pulled off the cover like she was unveiling a statue. The wheel was a beauty Pennsylvania Dutch make, with carved flowers along the frame. The wood gleamed even through the dust, maple aged to the color of honey. Adelaide's mother's initials were burned into the base, E.P.M., Elizabeth Palmer Morrison. Next to it sat the loom, a 4-shaft counterbalance loom that must have cost $50 new. Adelaide ran her twisted fingers along the beams, and her face showed something Vera recognized: grief for what her hands could no longer do. Adelaide lit a kerosene lamp and set it on the work table. She wrote, "My husband won't be home until late. Brennan's been causing trouble at the saloon, and John has to keep watch." She showed Vera how to work the wheel. The mechanism was smooth as butter, nothing like the rough wheels Vera had used before. The treadle responded to the slightest pressure. Adelaide demonstrated the rhythm with her foot, though her hands couldn't manage the fiber. Vera took a handful of carded wool she'd managed to clean and caught about a pound that afternoon. The wheel hummed as it spun, vibrating through the floorboards. Her left hand held the wool supply. Her right hand drew it out, controlling the twist. The thread that emerged was still uneven, but stronger than anything she'd made with her makeshift tools. Adelaide watched for a while, then wrote, "Close your eyes." Now, that might seem strange, telling a deaf woman to close her eyes. But Adelaide knew something. She'd been watching Vera work in the smokehouse, seen how her fingers seemed to see better than her eyes. Vera closed her eyes. The world narrowed to touch. The wool fibers had different textures, some smooth, some with tiny scales that caught against her fingertips. She could feel the twist traveling up the thread, feel exactly when it was enough, when it was too much. Her breathing fell into rhythm with the wheel's rotation. The thread that emerged was different, consistent, even strong. When she opened her eyes, Adelaide was smiling the first time Vera had seen that. The older woman had wound the thread onto a bobbin, held it up to the lamplight. It absorbed the light, black as a starless night. Adelaide wrote, "Now the loom. Setting up a loom is particular work. The warp threads have to be exactly the same tension, or the fabric will pucker and pull." Adelaide showed Vera the process, using white thread first so she could see the pattern, over, under, through the heddles, around the back beam. 500 threads for a basic width of fabric. But when Vera tried with her black thread, she couldn't see the pattern. The black absorbed the lamplight, made everything shadow. Adelaide started to light another lamp, but Vera held up her hand. She had an idea. She closed her eyes again and let her fingers do the seeing. Each thread had a slightly different feel. Some had more twist, some less. She could feel the path each thread needed to take, feel when one was too tight or too loose. Her fingers read the loom like her mother had taught her to read the Bible, word by word, line by line. It took 3 hours to thread the loom properly. Adelaide dozed in her chair, waking occasionally to check the progress. By the time the church bell struck 10, Vera had the loom ready. She sat at the bench, feet on the treadles, hands on the beater bar. The first shed opened, half the threads lifting. She threw the shuttle through. The thread caught, perfect. Beat it down. Change the shed. Throw again. The fabric that emerged was unlike anything either woman had seen. The black was so deep it seemed to pull light from the room. But there was something else, a pattern in the weave that you couldn't quite see, only sense. Like looking at water at night and knowing it's moving, even though you can't see it. Adelaide woke fully and came close. She held the fabric to the lamp, turned it this way and that. She wrote one word, "how." Vera didn't know how to explain that when she couldn't see. Her fingers found rhythms her eyes would have missed, that the black wool wanted to be woven a certain way, and she was just following what it told her. Adelaide wrote something else, and her hand shook as she did. "This is worth money, real money." Then they both heard it, or rather, Adelaide heard it, and Vera felt it through the floor. Footsteps on the boardwalk outside, heavy boots, multiple sets. Adelaide grabbed the lamp and blew it out. In the darkness, she found Vera's hand and squeezed it tight. The footsteps stopped right outside the shop's front window. April came to Wyoming territory the way it always did, fitful as a colicky baby. Warm one day and spitting snow the next. Vera had been working in Adelaide's back room for 3 weeks now, and Lord knows she'd found her rhythm. Every morning before the town woke, she'd slip through the back door with her key. Adelaide had given her that trust, and Vera held it careful as fresh eggs. The spinning wheel sat waiting in the corner, and she'd oil it, first thing just a drop on each bearing, the way Adelaide's mother must have done 50 years ago. Now, I should tell you about the peculiar thing Vera discovered. When she set that wheel spinning and closed her eyes, her heartbeat would match its rhythm. Thump, spin, like the wheel was teaching her body a new way to be. The thread that came from this rhythm was different, had a life to it that thread made in a hurry never could. The black wool from Brennan's trash heap was nearly gone. She'd stretched it far as she could, mixing in some gray wool Adelaide had found in her storeroom. Wool nobody wanted because it wasn't pure white and wasn't pure black. But in Vera's hands, that gray wool learned to dance with the black, creating thread with depth like looking into a well. She'd been working alone for 8 days straight when the Chinese woman appeared at the back door. Mrs. Chen ran the laundry down on Water Street, you know, where the decent folks pretended not to go, but everyone's sheets ended up anyway. She was maybe 40, hard to tell with the way work-age folks back then. Her hands were red and raw from lye soap, but her eyes were sharp as broken glass. She stood in that doorway holding a basket. Turnips, fresh from her garden plot behind the laundry. Chinese folks grew vegetables nobody else knew what to do with bok choy, those long white radishes that burned your tongue. But turnips, everyone understood turnips. Mrs. Chen set the basket down and pulled out a slate, not a child's school slate, but a proper one with a wood frame. She wrote in careful English, "Tradishike." Then she pointed at the spinning wheel. Now, Vera had gotten used to folks staring at her like she was a circus act, but this was different. Mrs. Chen wasn't gawking. She was studying, the way a person studies something they need to learn. Vera looked at those turnips, purple-topped, white as snow underneath, the size of a baby's head. Her stomach cramped just looking at them. She'd been living on cornmeal mush and the occasional egg when Adelaide remembered to bring one. She nodded and gestured for Mrs. Chen to come in. The Chinese woman moved different from white women, quiet, like she was used to not taking up space. She stood beside the spinning wheel and watched Vera work. Her eyes followed the thread from the wool supply to the wheel to the bobbin. After a while, she pulled out her slate. "You feel it, Nazi? Smart woman." Mrs. Chen. She'd noticed what took most folks weeks to understand. Vera nodded and held out the thread for Mrs. Chen to touch. The woman's laundry-rough fingers were more sensitive than they looked. She rubbed the thread between her fingertips, and her eyebrows went up. She wrote, "Strong, but soft. How?" This was the hard part, explaining something that lived in your fingers, not in words. Vera took a handful of raw black wool and placed it in Mrs. Chen's palm. Then she took the woman's hand and showed her how to pull the fibers. Gentle, but firm, like combing a child's hair when it's tangled. Mrs. Chen caught on quick. Her hands already knew about working with fibers. She dealt with fabric all day, knew how threads could be coaxed or ruined. She tried pulling the wool, and at first pulled too hard. The fibers broke. She tried again, lighter this time. Better. Then Mrs. Chen did something that about knocked Vera over with surprise. She held up her hand and made shapes with her fingers, specific shapes, deliberate, finger spelling, the alphabet deaf folks used in schools back east. Vera's heart jumped like a spooked horse. She signed back slow because she was rusty. "You know signs." Mrs. Chen smiled, first time Vera had seen that, and signed Mission School, California, before married. Well, if that didn't beat all. Here was someone who could talk to her proper, not through writing or pointing or Adelaide's translation. They worked together the rest of that morning. Mrs. Chen's scenes were different from what Vera had learned, mixed with something that might have been Chinese signs, but they understood each other. Mrs. Chen asked about the wool. Why black, not white? Vera explained about the lanolin, how black wool held more of it, how it made the thread waterproof. "Show me." Mrs. Chen signed. Vera had been working on something, a small square of fabric, maybe 6 inches. She'd woven it tight as she could, the threads so close together you couldn't see between them. She poured water from Adelaide's pitcher onto the fabric. The water beat it up and rolled off like rain on a duck's back. Mrs. Chen's eyes went wide. She touched the fabric, felt how the water hadn't penetrated at all. She signed fast, excited. Umbrellas? Rain clothes? Fishermen would pay gold. But then she signed something else. Why you not sell? Vera had to think about that. Adelaide had been trying to find buyers, but folks were suspicious. A deaf woman making fabric must be something wrong with it. And Brennan had been spreading talk that the wool was diseased. That's why it was black. Mrs. Chen stood up straighter. She signed, I know people, Chinese merchants. They understand good work, not care if maker is deaf. She pulled out a silver dollar from her apron, probably a week's worth of washing, and put it on the table. She pointed at the fabric square. Vera shook her head and pushed the dollar back. She cut a piece of fabric the size of a handkerchief and gave it to Mrs. Chen. Test first, she sighed. Show your merchants. If good, then we trade. Mrs. Chen tucked that fabric piece into her apron like it was gold leaf. She signed, I bring someone tomorrow. You teach. Now that was a thought. Teaching someone else what lived in her fingers. But Mrs. Chen's eyes were serious as church. Vera nodded. The next morning, Mrs. Chen didn't come alone. She brought her daughter, a girl maybe 13, small for her age. The girl had the same sharp eyes as her mother, but her hands were still soft, unmarked by lie and labor. The girl's name was Lily, English name for the mission school, Mrs. Chen explained through signs. But here was the remarkable thing. Lily was partially deaf, not from fever, but from birth. She heard some sounds, but not words, lived in that strange middle place between silence and noise. Mrs. Chen signed she learns laundry, but this better, skilled work, good money. Vera studied the girl. Lily stood straight, chin up, but her hands trembled slightly, scared, but trying not to show it. Vera recognized that. She'd been that girl once, before the fever, when her mother was teaching her to sew and she was afraid of ruining the fabric. Vera took Lily's hands, soft as rose petals. Nothing like her own work-hardened ones. She placed them on the spinning wheel, let her feel the vibration when it turned. Lily's face changed surprise, then interest. The teaching was different from working alone. Vera had to break down each movement, show how the twist traveled up the thread, how tension changed everything. Lily's fingers were clumsy at first. The thread broke and broke again. The girl's face went red, but Mrs. Chen signed to her daughter, sharp, quick signs that Vera couldn't quite follow. Lily straightened up and tried again. This time, she closed her eyes, like she'd seen Vera do. Her fingers found a rhythm. The thread still broke, but less often. By noon, Lily had produced an arm's length of lumpy, uneven thread. She held it up like it was spun silver, grinning so wide it must have hurt her cheeks. Mrs. Chen signed to Vera. How long to learn proper? Months, Vera signed back. Maybe year. Mrs. Chen nodded like she'd expected that. She signed, I pay for teaching, real money, and she paused, her fingers hesitating. I know where to get black wool, cheap. Chinese shepherds out near Rock Springs. They raise black sheep because white ranchers won't buy from them anyway. Vera's breath caught, steady supply of black wool. That changed everything, Mrs. Chen continued. But Brennan, he makes trouble for Chinese, too. Says we steal. Says we bring disease. They all knew about Brennan's reach. He'd gotten 2 Chinese families run out of town last year, claiming they were stealing chickens. No proof. But when had that mattered? Adelaide appeared in the doorway then, back from the front shop. Her face was grim. She wrote on her pad, Brennan's filed a complaint. Says, you stole that wool. Sheriff's coming. Mrs. Chen grabbed Lily's hand, ready to run. But Adelaide held up her hand. She wrote, not to arrest, to investigate. My husband wants the truth. She turned to Mrs. Chen and wrote, you were never here? Mrs. Chen understood. She and Lily slipped out the back door quiet as shadows. But Mrs. Chen left something on the table, a small cloth bundle. Inside were seeds, vegetable seeds from China, worth their weight in silver on the frontier. Adelaide looked at those seeds, Then at Vera, she wrote, "We're building something here, all of us outcasts." Through the window, Vera could see Sheriff Morrison coming down the street. Behind him walked Jake Brennan, strutting like a rooster who owned the whole barnyard. But there was someone else with them, a man in a city suit, carrying a leather case, a judge. They'd brought a judge. That judge from Laramie was a thin stick of a man, looked like he'd been sucked dry by prairie wind. Judge Whitman, his name was, and he had a way of looking at you that made you feel like he could see every lie you'd ever told. Sheriff Morrison, Adelaide's husband, he stood different when the judge was around, stiffer, like his uniform had starch in it. He led them all into the shop. And I tell you, Brennan's boots made enough noise for 3 men, stomping like he owned the place. Adelaide's hands were steady as she opened the storeroom door. There sat Vera at the loom, shuttle in hand, that black fabric growing inch by inch under her fingers. The judge walked straight to it, pulled out spectacles from his vest pocket. "Now, you have to understand what happened next." Brennan started talking, his mouth running like a mill wheel. Vera could see his lips forming the words, "Thief, my wool, stolen property." But Sheriff Morrison, bless him, he pulled out his notepad and showed it to the judge. Whatever was written there made the judge's eyebrows rise up like window shades. The judge wrote something on a paper and showed it to Vera. "Did you take wool from the Hartley Ranch?" Vera nodded. No point in lying. Was it from the sorting barn? She shook her head and wrote on Adelaide's pad, "Behind barn, in mud, rained on 3 days." The judge examined the fabric on the loom. His fingers pale as fish, barely rubbed the weave. He pulled out a magnifying glass, the kind jewelers used, and studied it close. Then he did something nobody expected. He pulled a thread loose and put it in his mouth, tasting it. He wrote, "This has been washed with soapwort, not lye." That was true. Vera couldn't afford lye. Had used the wild soapwort that grew by the creek. The judge turned to Brennan. His mouth moved, and Brennan's face went from red to purple. Brennan pulled out a paper from his coat, looked official, with a seal and everything. The judge read it, showed it to Sheriff Morrison, then to Adelaide. Adelaide's face went white as fresh linen. She wrote for Vera, "He's filed claim of theft. Says you owe him for the wool plus damages. $50. $50. Might as well have been 500. The judge wrote, "You have 2 weeks to pay, or prove the wool was abandoned. Court date set for May 1st. They left after that, Brennan smirking like a cat with cream. Sheriff Morrison stayed behind, and he wrote, "I'll help if I can, but Brennan's got friends in high places." May rolled in hot and dusty. Vera had spent every waking hour at that loom, trying to make enough fabric to sell, to raise that $50. Adelaide had tried to help, even offered to loan the money, but her husband had put his foot down. Can't have the sheriff's wife paying legal fines for someone accused of theft. The morning of May 1st came too fast, but 3 days before that, something happened that changed the game. See? There was this Mercantile on Front Street, Hoffman's Dry Goods, biggest shop between Cheyenne and Laramie. Mr. Hoffman was a German fella, been in Wyoming since before it was Wyoming. He had connections in San Francisco, Denver, even Chicago. Adelaide had been pestering Vera to take her samples there. "Just try," she'd written. "What's the worst that can happen?" Well, Vera found out the worst that May morning. She'd wrapped her best samples in brown paper, 3 different weaves, each one showing something different the black wool could do. One was dense as felt, but somehow still soft. Another was light as air, but strong enough to use for horse blankets. The third was that special fabric that seemed to swallow light. Hoffman's store smelled of coffee beans and new leather, pickle brine, and tobacco. The floorboards creaked under her feet as she walked to the counter. Mr. Hoffman stood there, thick as a barrel, his mustache waxed to points that could put your eye out. Two women were examining ribbons near the window, Mrs. Baker, the banker's wife, and Mrs. Sterling, whose husband owned the biggest spread north of town. They looked up when Vera entered, and their faces changed like milk going sour. Vera set her samples on the counter. Mr. Hoffman didn't even look at them. He pointed at the door. His mouth formed one word, out, but Vera stood her ground. She unwrapped the first sample, held it up to the light from the window. Even from across the store, you could see the quality. The fabric didn't shine like silk, but it had depth, like looking into deep water. Mrs. Baker said something to Mrs. Sterling. They both laughed, high and sharp, like breaking glass. Vera unwrapped the second sample. Mr. Hoffman's hand slammed down on the counter. He came around it, moving fast for such a big man. He grabbed Vera's arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. That's when Adelaide walked in. She'd been watching from across the street, waiting to see what would happen. She spoke sharp words to Hoffman. Vera could see his grip loosen. Adelaide pulled out a card from her purse, showed it to him. Whatever was on that card made him step back. But the damage was done. Mrs. Baker and Mrs. Sterling pushed past Vera on their way out. Mrs. Baker's silk dress brushed against Vera's cotton one, and she pulled away like she might catch something. At the door, Mrs. Sterling turned back. Her mouth moved, and though Vera couldn't hear the words, she could read them, clear, trash from trash. They left Vera standing there with her samples spread on the counter. Mr. Hoffman wouldn't even touch them with his hands. He used a pencil to push them back toward her. Adelaide's face was tight with anger. She helped Vera rewrap the samples, and they walked out together. But on the boardwalk, Adelaide stopped. She wrote, "Wait here." She went back in, through the window. Vera could see her talking to Hoffman, her finger pointing at his chest. He shook his head. She said something else. His face changed. When Adelaide came out, she wrote one word, coward. They started walking back to Adelaide's shop, but someone called out. Vera felt the vibration through the boardwalk, someone running. They turned to see an old woman hurrying after them, moving pretty spry for someone who must have been 70 if she was a day. This was Mrs. Hazel Fitzgerald, and if you didn't know her story, you wouldn't understand what happened next. She'd run a dress shop in Boston before the war, made gowns for senators' wives. But the war took her son at Antietam. Her husband died of grief, and she'd come west to escape the memories. Now she did mending and alterations from a narrow shop squeezed between the barber and the undertaker. She caught up to them, breathing hard. She pulled out a card, not a business card, but a carte de visite photograph. The image showed a young man in union blue, serious-faced, maybe 20 years old. She wrote on a small pad, "My William, embody, finally coming home. 17 years late." Adelaide touched the old woman's arm. Gentle-like. Mrs. Fitzgerald continued writing, "I saw your fabric in Hoffman's. Before he put it away." She reached for Vera's package. Vera hesitated, then unwrapped one sample. The old woman pulled out a jeweler's loupe from her pocket, seemed like everyone had one those days, and examined the weave. Her hand started shaking. She wrote, "I haven't seen this quality since Brussels. 1854. I was there, buying for my shop." She looked at Vera different now, not seeing the deaf woman, but the craftswoman. She wrote, "Can you make mourning cloth true black that won't fade, won't show salt marks?" Vera nodded. "How much?" Adelaide started to write something, but Mrs. Fitzgerald waved her off. She wrote, I'll pay San Francisco prices, $3 a yard. 20 yards for a full morning ensemble, $60, more than enough for the fine. With money left over, Mrs. Fitzgerald pulled out her purse. Gold coins caught the light. She counted out $20 as deposit. Real gold eagles, not paper money. She wrote, 2 weeks. Can you do it? 2 weeks, 20 yards. It would mean working day and night, fingers bleeding, back aching, but $60. Vera nodded. Mrs. Fitzgerald wrote one more thing. My nephew is Judge Porter, Federal Circuit Court in Denver. She tucked that photograph back in her pocket and walked away, her back straight as a measuring rod. Adelaide and Vera stood there on the boardwalk, $20 in gold between them. But then Vera noticed something. Down the street, outside the courthouse, Jake Brennan was talking to a man in a black suit. The man had papers in his hand, and Brennan was smiling like a man who'd just drawn 4 aces. Adelaide locked the shop door behind them and pulled every window shade down tight. The storeroom felt like a cave, cool and dark, with only the one lamp throwing shadows on the walls. She sat Vera down at the work table and started writing fast. That man with Brennan, that's Prosecutor Jameson from Laramie, never lost a case. The 20 gold dollars from Mrs. Fitzgerald sat between them, catching lamplight. Real money, but maybe not enough if Brennan had hired himself a fancy lawyer. Adelaide's bent fingers moved across the table to those coins, then pulled back. She wrote, I need to show you something. She stood up, moving stiff like her joints pained her more than usual. At the back of the storeroom was a cabinet Vera had never seen opened. Adelaide pulled out a key from deep in her pocket, not from her regular ring, but hidden separate. Inside that cabinet were bolts of fabric. But Lord have mercy, what fabric! Even in the dim light, Vera could see the quality. Silk from China, wool so fine it might have been cashmere, Irish linen white as fresh cream. Adelaide pulled out one bolt black wool, but not American wool. The fibers were longer, finer. She wrote, from Scotland, $25 a yard in Denver. She unwrapped a corner, held it next to Vera's black fabric. They were both black as midnight, but that's where the similarity ended. The Scottish wool was perfect, too perfect. Machine spun, mush and woven, every thread exactly the same. Vera's fabric was alive. The threads varied just enough to catch light different ways. The hand spinning had given it character that no machine could match. Adelaide wrote, I used to make gowns. Before my hands went bad, she held up those twisted fingers, and for the first time, Vera really looked at them. Not just arthritis. The joints were swollen wrong, pulled in directions that must hurt something fierce. Started 5 years ago, Adelaide wrote. Lost all my wealthy clients. They want someone who can do fine needlework, embroidery, beading. She pulled out a dress from the cabinet, half finished. Beautiful blue silk. The bodice was perfect, but where the embroidery should have been, there were just pencil marks showing the pattern. Adelaide's eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying, not quite. She wrote, I can still see what needs doing, just can't do it. Then she wrote something else. But you can. She spread Vera's black fabric on the table, ran her bent fingers across it, where her fingers touched. She left little pieces of paper, each with a single word, rainproof, tearproof, stainproof, saltproof, writing habits. She wrote, every rancher's wife needs them. They pay $20 for inferior ones from Denver. Adelaide stood up, went to another cabinet. This one wasn't locked. Inside hung samples of riding habit split skirts, fitted jackets, all in brown or gray wool. She pulled one out, and right away Vera could see the problem. Water stains at the hem, wear marks where the saddle rubbed, salt lines from sweat. Your black wool solves all this, Adelaide wrote. She pulled out more paper, started sketching. Her bent fingers could barely hold the pencil, but the lines were sure. A writing habit, but different. Longer jacket to protect from wind. Reinforced panels where the saddle would rub. Hidden pockets for the things ranch women needed: medicine for horses, tools for fences, sometimes a small pistol. Vera picked up the pencil and added her own ideas. Double layer the skirt hem where it would drag in mud. Use the tighter weave for areas that needed strength, the softer weave where it needed to move. They worked like that for an hour, passing the pencil back and forth. Not talking couldn't talk, even if Vera could hear, but understanding each other perfect through the sketches. Then Adelaide wrote, "Partnership. You make the fabric and do the sewing. My hands can't. I handle customers, money, orders. 60-40 split. 60 to you because you do the real work." Vera stared at those numbers. Most shops, the owner took 70, 80%, left the workers with barely enough to eat. Adelaide wasn't done. "And we start with Mrs. Hartley." Now, that was a name to conjure with. Mrs. Hartley, wife of the richest rancher in 3 counties. The woman who decided what was fashionable for every other ranch wife. Adelaide wrote, "She comes in tomorrow, needs new riding clothes. Her old ones are from Denver, silk-lined, totally impractical, ruined in 1 season." She pulled out a measuring tape, showed Vera how to take measurements proper, not just bust waist hips, but shoulder slope, arm pitch, the way a woman stood, the way she moved. Every body was different, and good clothes honored that difference. "Mrs. Hartley is particular," Adelaide wrote, "but if she approves, everyone follows." They heard footsteps on the boardwalk outside. Both women froze. The footsteps passed. Adelaide wrote, "We need to move fast. 20 yards for Mrs. Fitzgerald, plus a riding habit for Mrs. Hartley. That's 30 yards total in 2 weeks. 30 yards. The most Vera had ever made was 3 yards in a week, and that about killed her. But Adelaide was already planning. She wrote, "Mrs. Chen knows weavers, Chinese women who work at home. They can't sell to white shops, but they can work for us, preparing wool, spinning thread." It was risky. If word got out they were employing Chinese workers, Brennan would use it against them. But without help, 30 yards was impossible. Adelaide wrote, "Tomorrow, early, go to Mrs. Chen, take her this." She counted out 5 gold dollars. "Advance payment for workers. Tell her we need thread, black thread, spun fine but strong." Then Adelaide did something unexpected. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small revolver. She wrote, "My husband's backup gun. Keep it here when you work alone." Vera had never held a gun. It was heavier than she expected, cold as a winter iron. "I don't think Brennan will try anything physical," Adelaide wrote, "but men do foolish things when money's involved." They worked until midnight setting up the loom for production weaving. Adelaide showed Vera tricks she'd learned from her mother: how to wind multiple bobbins at once, how to fix broken threads without it showing, how to keep tension perfect even when your arms were tired. When they finally stopped, Vera's fingers were cramping and her back felt like someone had hit it with a fence post. Adelaide looked just as tired, her face gray in the lamplight. Adelaide wrote, "Go home, rest, tomorrow we start war." But as Vera walked to the door, Adelaide caught her sleeve. She wrote one more thing. "Brennan came by yesterday, offered me $200 to fire you. $200. More money than most folks saw in a year." Adelaide tore up the paper she'd written that on, dropped the pieces on the floor. She wrote, "I told him I'd see him in hell first." The next morning came cold and gray, more like March than May. Vera slipped through the dawn streets to Water Street. where the Chinese laundries were already sending up steam that smelled of lye and starch. Mrs. Chen was in her yard, stirring a huge pot of boiling sheets with a stick thick as her arm. When she saw Vera, she set down the stick and wiped her hands on her apron. Vera showed her the gold coins and signed what Adelaide had proposed. Mrs. Chen's eyes went wide. She signed back, $5 real gold. Vera nodded and added, "Need thread in 3 days. Can you find spinners?" Mrs. Chen thought, then signed, "I know 4 women, good hands, but scared of trouble." She meant scared of Brennan, scared of the law, scared of being Chinese in a white town. Vera signed, "No one needs to know. They work at home. You bring thread to Adelaide's shop. Back door, Dawn." Mrs. Chen weighed those gold coins in her hand. $5 could feed a Chinese family for 2 months. She signed, "We do it." But then she signed something else. "Lily wants to learn every day. She practices all night, fingers bleeding." Vera thought about that girl, trying to spin thread in the dark, teaching herself by touch. She signed, "Bring her tomorrow, Dawn, 1-hour lesson before a shop opens." Mrs. Chen's face did something Vera had never seen. She smiled full out, not hiding it behind her hand the way Chinese women usually did. She signed, "You are teaching her to be more than a washerwoman's daughter." Walking back to Adelaide's shop, Vera noticed something wrong. The usual morning bustle was missing. No one at the bakery, no one at the barber shop. Then she saw why. A crowd had gathered at the courthouse. Maybe 30 people, all facing the steps where Judge Whitman stood with papers in his hand. Brennan was beside him, and that prosecutor, Jameson, was talking loud enough that Vera could feel the vibration through her feet. Sheriff Morrison stood to the side, his face grim. He saw Vera and shook his head, "Stay away." But Adelaide was in that crowd. She pushed through to Vera, her face white. She wrote on her pad, her hands shaking. "They've moved the court date. Tomorrow. Jameson says you're planning to flee." Tomorrow. No time to make the fabric for Mrs. Fitzgerald. No time to prove anything. Adelaide wrote something else. "And they've added a charge, grand theft. If you lose, it's not just a fine." She underlined the last words. "It's prison." That afternoon, round about 3 o'clock, when most folks were inside avoiding the heat, 3 men arrived on the westbound stage. Now, you could tell right away they weren't from Wyoming. Their clothes were too fine, their boots too shiny, and they walked like they had somewhere important to be. Adelaide and Vera were in the back room, frantically working on Mrs. Fitzgerald's mourning cloth. They'd managed 6 yards since dawn. Vera's fingers moving so fast the shuttle was just a blur. The loom shook with each beat of the bar, rattling the windows in their frames. Sheriff Morrison came through the back door without knocking. His face had that look men get when they're holding bad news. He wrote on his pad, 3 men asking about black wool fabric. From San Francisco. They're at the Railway Hotel. Adelaide's hands stopped sorting thread. She wrote, "Buyers. Don't think so. They have tools, testing equipment." Vera kept weaving. Whatever these men wanted, she had 18 hours until court. 18 hours to prove she wasn't a thief. The shuttle flew through the shed, back and forth, building fabric thread by thread. But an hour later, the men appeared at Adelaide's shop. The bell rang when they entered, and even from the back room, Vera felt the floorboards shift under their weight. Adelaide went to meet them. Through the doorway, Vera could see the tallest one, a man with silver hair and hands stained purple-blue from indigo dye. The second was shorter, with burn scars on his neck that disappeared into his collar. The third was ancient, bent-backed, moving careful like each step hurt. Adelaide came back, her face puzzled. She wrote, "They want to see you. They know about the black wool." The men had spread their equipment on Adelaide's counter, like surgeons preparing to operate. Glass vials, copper strips, a lamp that burned with a blue flame, magnifying lenses and brass housings. The tall one, Mr. Friedrich, Adelaide wrote his name, pulled out a leather portfolio. Inside were fabric samples, each one labeled with dates going back 100 years. Some were behind glass, too precious to touch. The old man pulled out one particular sample. The label read, Bruges, 1453. The fabric was so fine it looked like black water. Friedrich spoke to Adelaide, who translated, "They're from the Master Weavers Guild of California. They heard about your work from Mrs. Hartley's cousin in San Francisco." Mrs. Hartley, the richest rancher's wife. She'd been in the shop 2 days ago, felt the black fabric, left without buying anything. But she must have written to her cousin. Friedrich pointed at Vera's hands. The stains were permanent now, worked so deep into her skin that Lai couldn't touch them. He pulled out a jeweler's loop, German-made, brass and crystal, and examined her fingers like they were precious artifacts. Then he asked for a demonstration. Vera looked at the men, at their fine clothes, their expensive tools, at the old man leaning heavy on a walking stick topped with a silver wolf's head. These weren't buyers. They were craftsmen. They'd know if she was real or fake in about 10 seconds. Adelaide set up a screen, a white sheet hung from a rope, so the men could watch Vera's shadow but not see her actual hands. Trade secrets were trade secrets, even when showing off. Vera took a handful of black wool, the last of her good stuff. She carded it slow, letting them see the rhythm. The shadow of her hands on the sheet looked like birds in flight, swooping and diving. Then to the wheel. The thread emerged steady, even, strong. The burnt man stepped forward. He pulled out a wooden gauge with tiny marks along its length. He measured the thread at 12 different points. His eyebrows went up. He showed the measurements to Friedrich. Friedrich spoke. Adelaide translated. Consistent within 1,000th of an inch. Machines can't achieve that. Now the old man moved, slow, each step deliberate. But his eyes were sharp as glass. He took the thread between his fingers, gnarled, twisted with age, and pulled. The thread stretched but didn't break. He pulled harder, still held. He spoke, his voice rough, and Adelaide wrote, "Show the loom." Vera had to rethread, for the demonstration couldn't show them Mrs. Fitzgerald's mourning cloth, not yet finished. The men watched every movement. The old man came close enough that Vera could smell him pipe tobacco and wool oil, the smell of a life spent with fabric. When she started weaving, the old man made a sound, not quite a gasp, more like recognition. He grabbed Friedrich's arm, pointed at the pattern emerging in the cloth. They argued in German or maybe Swiss. Adelaide wasn't sure. The burnt man pulled out that leather portfolio again, found a specific sample. He held it next to Vera's work. The weave pattern matched exactly. "Impossible," Adelaide translated Friedrich's word. "This technique died with the Flemish Guild. Plague of 14. The old man wrote something on paper, showed it to Vera. "You rediscovered it, through touch." They wanted to know everything, how she'd learned, who taught her, where she'd found the pattern. Adelaide translated Vera's signs, self-taught, no teacher. The pattern lived in her fingers. Friedrich pulled out a different paper, official-looking, with seals and stamps. He spoke at length while Adelaide translated. "Full membership in the California Guild, workshop in San Francisco, salary of $200 monthly, apprentices to train, $200 monthly." Vera's hands stopped moving, but there was more. Friedrich kept talking. "Exclusive contract, all work property of the Guild, immediate relocation required." Adelaide's face had gone pale. She wrote, "They want you to leave, Tonight, they have train tickets." The old man pulled something from his coat, a leather purse, heavy. He poured the contents on the counter, gold coins, 20 of them, $400. He pointed at the purse, then at the door. "Signing bonus." Adelaide translated. "But you have to decide now." Vera looked at that gold, enough to pay Brennan's fine 8 times over. Enough to set her up proper, maybe bring her mother's relatives from Missouri. Enough to never worry about food or shelter again. Friedrich spoke again. Adelaide's hand shook as she wrote, "They know about the court case, about Brennan. They say you'll lose." The burnt man added something. Adelaide translated, "Prosecutor Jameson never loses, and Brennan's been appointed to the Commerce Commission. He'll control all business licenses soon." Vera's chest felt tight. Brennan on the Commerce Commission meant he could shut down any shop that employed her. Adelaide would lose her business just for helping. The old man stood straighter, spoke directly to Vera. Adelaide translated, "Your gift deserves better than this frontier town. We'll protect your work, preserve the technique. You'll be remembered. Remembered in California. Far from the widows who needed mourning clothes they could afford, far from Mrs. Chen and Lily, from Adelaide, from the life she'd started to build from black wool and stubborn determination." Friedrich pulled out a pocket watch, gold, with the guild seal on the cover. He showed her the time, 7:30 p.m. He spoke, and Adelaide translated, "Train leaves at 9. We'll wait at the station until 8:45. They packed up their equipment, precise and careful. The old man paused at the door, looked back at Vera, his mouth moved, and Adelaide translated one last time. "Don't waste your gift on people who see you as trash." After they left, Adelaide sank into a chair. She wrote, "You should go." Vera shook her head. "Prison, Vera, that's what Jameson will push for. 6 months. Hard labor minimum." 6 months. Her hands would be ruined. Everything she'd built would disappear, and Adelaide would suffer for helping her. But on the loom sat 6 yards of mourning cloth for Mrs. Fitzgerald. In the back room were $5 gold for Mrs. Chen's spinners. And tomorrow morning, Lily would come for her lesson, fingers ready to learn. Adelaide wrote, "It's 8 o'clock. You could still make the train." Through the window, Vera could see the railway hotel. The 3 guild men would be waiting. $400 in gold, train tickets west, a new life where her skill mattered more than her deafness. Then the back door opened, not knocked opened. Tommy the stable boy stood there, thin as a fence rail, his clothes dusty from hard travel. Behind him was a woman in a brown suit, stern-faced, carrying a leather briefcase. The woman pulled out a card, Sarah Whitman, attorney at law. Tommy held up a crumpled paper. His writing was shaky, but clear. "I saw Brennan dump the wool. Bissy will testify." Adelaide grabbed the table for support. Sarah Whitman spoke, and Adelaide translated, "Mrs. Hartley hired me. We've been building a case." But then Sarah's face changed. She spoke urgently, and Adelaide wrote fast. "Jameson's bringing in 3 witnesses, ranch hands who'll swear they saw you steal." 3 lying witnesses against one boy's truth. The train whistle sounded, 9 o'clock departure. The guild men would wait 45 more minutes. Tommy wrote something else on his paper. "There's more. Other ranches dumped black wool. I have names." But would anyone believe a stable boy over 3 grown men? Sarah Whitman set her briefcase on Adelaide's counter with a thump that rattled the thread spools. She was maybe 35, with the kind of face that had seen too much courtroom nonsense to be surprised by anything. Her hands, when she pulled out papers, were steady as a surgeon's. Tommy stood beside her, trying to look older than his 14 years. Poor boy had ridden hard from Cheyenne dust in every crease of his clothes. his lips cracked from wind. His mother, standing behind him, kept touching his shoulder like she needed to make sure he was really there. Sarah wrote for Vera to read, "Mrs. Hartley told me everything about Brennan's schemes, about the black wool. She's been documenting his thefts for 2 years." Now, that was news. Mrs. Hartley keeping books on her own foreman. Sarah continued, "Her husband died 3 weeks ago. Brennan doesn't know she's been watching." Adelaide's hand went to her throat. Mr. Hartley dead, the richest rancher in 3 counties, gone. Sarah pulled out more papers, sworn statements, each with a red seal. She wrote, 5 ranchers confirmed they threw out black wool. All during March, all saw Brennan take credit for white wool he never delivered. Tommy's mother finally spoke up. Adelaide translated her words. "They offered my boy $20 to disappear. Said they'd hurt him if he didn't take it." $20 or threats. That was Brennan's way. The train whistle sounded again. 3 long blasts, final boarding call. Through the window, Vera could see the station 2 blocks down. The guild men would be boarding now, taking their offer with them. Sarah noticed Vera looking. She wrote, "You could still go. No shame in protecting yourself." But Tommy was watching her with eyes that knew about running, about being scared, about standing up anyway. This boy had risked everything to come back and tell the truth. Vera turned back to the loom. 6 yards done. 24 to go. Her fingers started moving, throwing the shuttle with a rhythm that made the whole loom sing. Sarah watched for a moment, then wrote, "Court is at 10 tomorrow morning. Be ready by 9. After Sarah and Tommy left, Adelaide locked the door, and they worked through the night. Vera at the loom, Adelaide preparing thread, both women moving in a dance they'd perfected over the weeks. No need for words. Adelaide knew when Vera needed more bobbins. Vera knew when Adelaide's hands needed rest. By dawn, they had 12 yards. Halfway there, Mrs. Chen arrived at first light with Lily and 4 other women, all carrying bundles. They'd worked through the night, too, spinning thread. Not just any thread, black thread so fine it looked like human hair. So strong, you could lift a saddle with it. Lily's hands were bandaged where the wheel had cut them, but she was smiling. She signed to Vera, "I spun 3 pounds. Mother says it's good." It was better than good. It was perfect. The women set up in the back room, each at a spinning wheel Adelaide had somehow procured, borrowed, begged, or bought. Vera didn't know. The wheels hummed in harmony, 5 voices singing the same song. At 8 o'clock, Mrs. Fitzgerald arrived. She looked at the 12 yards complete, ran her fingers along the selvage. She wrote, "It's better than what I had in Boston." She pulled out $40, the rest of her payment. But then she did something unexpected. She wrote, "I'll be at the trial. My nephew needs to know what kind of work you do." Her nephew, Judge Porter, the federal circuit judge in Denver, not presiding over this trial. But his opinion carried weight. At 9 o'clock, Adelaide helped Vera into her best dress, really her only dress that wasn't stained with wool. It was brown calico, mended at the elbows, but clean. Adelaide had pressed it with her good iron, made it look respectable. Sheriff Morrison came to walk them to the courthouse. His face was grim. He wrote, "Jameson brought in 5 witnesses now, all swearing they saw you steal. 5 liars, against 1 boy and some papers." The courthouse smelled of tobacco juice and fear sweat. Every bench was full, seemed like the whole town had come to watch. In the front row sat the merchants who'd refused Vera's business. Behind them, the ranch wives who'd called her trash, all come to see her fall. But there were others, too. Mrs. Chen sat in the back with the Chinese merchants. Even though folks glared at them, Mrs. Fitzgerald, in her old black dress, spine straight as a ramrod, And Mrs. Hartley, Lord have mercy, Mrs. Hartley in widow's weeds, sitting right behind the defendant's table. Judge Whitman took his seat. His thin face showed nothing, like carved soap. Prosecutor Jameson stood up, and you could feel the confidence rolling off him like heat from a stove. He was maybe 50, silver-haired, wearing a suit that cost more than most folks' houses. He called his first witness, Jake Brennan himself, strutting to the witness chair like a bantam rooster. Jameson's questions came smooth as oil. When did you first notice the missing wool? How much was taken? What was its value? Brennan's lies flowed just as smooth. 50 pounds of prime wool, he said, worth $100 at market rates, taken from inside the sorting barn, not from the trash heap behind it. Sarah Whitman stood to cross-examine, next to Jameson. She looked young, her brown suit plain as dirt. But her voice, Vera could feel its power through the floorboards. She held up a paper, showed it to Brennan. His face changed. She asked something that made him lean back in his chair. He answered, but his voice had lost its confidence. She showed another paper. This time Brennan's face went red. Judge Whitman leaned forward, interested now. The next witnesses came and went. Ranch hands, each swearing they'd seen Vera inside the barn, stealing wool. But Sarah had papers for each of them, too. Employment records showing they weren't even at the ranch those days. Payment receipts with dates that didn't match their stories. By noon, Jameson's case was wobbling like a newborn calf. Then Sarah called Tommy. The boy walked to the witness chair like he was walking to his own hanging. His hands shook as he raised them for the oath. But when he spoke, Vera could see his mouth forming the words, clear and strong. Sarah's questions were gentle. Tommy's answers painted a picture Brennan kicking the black wool into the mud, saying it was worthless, contaminated, only fit for burning. 3 different times in March, same waste, same words. Jameson tried to destroy him. You could see it in how he stood, how he pointed, how he paced. A boy's word against grown men, who would believe that? But Tommy held firm. And then he said something that made Jameson stop mid-stride. Sarah translated for Vera later. Mr. Friedrich from the guild saw it too. He was buying wool that day. He's still in town. Jameson's face went white. The guild men hadn't left. They'd stayed for the trial. Judge Whitman called a recess. 15 minutes. Outside the courthouse, Vera saw them. Friedrich and the other 2 guild men standing with Mrs. Hartley. They were examining something, a piece of black fabric, the mourning cloth Vera had made. Mrs. Hartley saw Vera and walked over. She wrote on expensive paper, "They'll testify about the wool's value, about your skill." But Friedrich wasn't looking at Vera. He was looking past her, at someone approaching from the train station. A man in a federal marshal's badge, riding hard, dust cloud behind him like a storm coming. He dismounted right in front of Judge Whitman and handed him an envelope. The judge read it, and his thin face finally showed emotion. Surprise! Judge Whitman read that federal marshal's letter twice, his Adam's apple working like he was swallowing something bitter. He folded it careful, put it in his vest pocket, and called the court back to order. Now, I need you to understand what happened next, because it changed everything. The judge called Friedrich to testify. Not Sarah Whitman, not Jameson. The judge himself called that guildmaster to the stand. Friedrich walked to the witness chair like he owned it. The silver in his hair caught the afternoon light coming through the courthouse windows. When he raised his hand for the oath, those indigo stains on his fingers looked like badges of honor. Judge Whitman asked him direct, "What is your professional opinion of the wool in question?" Friedrich pulled out his Zeiss loop, held it up so everyone could see. He spoke clear enough that even Vera could read his lips. Black wool is not worthless. In European markets, it sells for triple the price of white. A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. Jameson stood up to object, but the judge waved him down. Friedrich continued, and Sarah translated for Vera. The technique Miss Hayes uses, we thought it was lost forever. The Flemish Guild in 453 created fabric that kings wore. Miss Hayes recreated it by touch, alone. He pulled out that piece of medieval fabric, held it next to a sample of Vera's work. Identical weave structure, but hers is better, stronger. Jameson tried to speak, but Judge Whitman held up that federal letter. He spoke, and the whole courtroom went quiet. Sarah wrote fast for Vera. Federal investigation. Brennan's been stealing from 6 ranches, selling their wool in Colorado, keeping the money. Brennan jumped up from his chair. Sheriff Morrison and his deputy moved to block the doors. Brennan's face had gone the color of raw liver. His mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. The judge continued. Sarah translated, Mr. Brennan, you're under federal arrest for interstate fraud. The marshal who'd brought the letter stepped forward. He had shackles in his hand, not rope, but proper iron shackles. They closed around Brennan's wrists with a sound that rang through the courthouse. But the trial wasn't over. Judge Whitman turned to Vera. He spoke slow, and Sarah translated, Miss Hayes, the court finds you not guilty of theft. Furthermore, the court orders Mr. Brennan to pay you damages of $200 for false accusation and loss of business. $200 from a man heading to federal prison? Mrs. Hartley stood up. She walked to the bench, pulled out a leather wallet. She counted out $200 in gold coins, set them on the judge's desk. I'll pay my former foreman's debt. Sarah translated her words. Consider it an investment. The next morning came bright and clear, one of those June days that made you forget Wyoming could be cruel. Vera stood in front of the corner building on Main and 3rd, the old Garrison Mercantile that had been empty since the owner died of pneumonia in April. Adelaide held the key. She'd negotiated the rent down to $15 a month, using the guild's offer as leverage. The landlord would rather have 15 than nothing. The door stuck. Years of dust had settled in the hinges. Sheriff Morrison put his shoulder to it, and it opened with a groan that Vera felt through her bones. Inside, dust motes danced in the morning light. The space was bigger than Adelaide's entire shop. The back room alone could hold 4 looms. The front had windows on 2 sides, light from morning to evening. Mrs. Chen and her workers arrived with brooms and buckets. They attacked that dirt like it had personally insulted them. By noon, the floors were clean enough to eat off. The windows sparkled. Even the old tin ceiling had been scrubbed until it reflected light like water. The guild men hadn't left town. They arrived that afternoon with a wagon. In it was a loom, not just any loom, but an 8-shaft counterbalance loom from Germany. Friedrich supervised the installation himself, making sure every beam was level, every heddle moved smooth as silk. A gift, Adelaide translated his words, from the guild, to preserve the technique. But Friedrich wasn't done. He pulled out a different paper, not a contract, but a commission. Sarah translated 50 yards of black fabric for a San Francisco exhibition. $1,000? $1,000. Vera's knees went weak. Friedrich added something else, and Adelaide translated, We won't take you from here, but we want to buy what you make. Exclusive rights to sell in California. It was a different offer. Stay in Wyoming, keep her workshop, her workers, her life, but have guaranteed buyers for everything she could produce. By September, Vera's workshop was the busiest place on Main Street. 4 looms running sunrise to sunset, Mrs. Chen managing 6 spinners, Lily working half days, her fingers getting stronger, her thread getting finer, But it was the girl who arrived in October who really mattered. Sophie, 12 years old, deaf from scarlet fever. Her parents had brought her from Denver, heard about Vera from Mrs. Fitzgerald's nephew, the federal judge. Sophie stood in the workshop doorway, her shoulders hunched like she expected to be sent away. Her mother's hands twisted her handkerchief into knots. Vera walked to the girl, took her hands, soft hands, city hands, but there was strength in them. She led Sophie to the loom, placed her palms on the beams. The vibration of the working loom traveled through the wood, through Sophie's hands, into her bones. The girl's eyes went wide. She could feel the rhythm, the song the loom was singing. Vera spent the morning teaching her to card wool. Sophie's first attempts were disasters, wool flying everywhere, cards held wrong, pressure all off. But she didn't cry, didn't quit. When the wool tangled, she picked it apart and tried again. By noon, she'd produced a small pile of carded wool, lumpy, uneven, but carded. She held it up like it was gold, grinning so wide it must have hurt. Her mother tried to pay, pulled out a purse heavy with coins, but Vera wrote, "No payment. She works for her teaching. Real work, real learning." Sophie came every day after that, dawn to noon, like her mother promised. Her hands went from soft to calloused. Her shoulders straightened. By December, she was spinning ugly thread, but strong. The workshop's success brought problems. Other merchants complained that Vera was taking their business. The Commerce Commission tried to revoke her license. But Mrs. Hartley's lawyer, she kept Sarah Whitman on retainer, now fought them off. Some folks still called her dummy when they thought she wasn't looking, still crossed the street to avoid her. But their wives bought her fabric. Their daughters wore dresses made from her wool. Money talked louder than prejudice. Winter came hard that year. December of 1881 brought snow that drifted higher than the windows, but the workshop stayed warm, 4 looms running, generated heat like a stove. The workers brought their lunches, ate together in the back room, Chinese and white and Mexican, all working side by side. Mrs. Chen's English got better. Adelaide's sign language got fluent. Even Sheriff Morrison learned a few signs, mostly coffee and thank you. But it was something. On December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, Friedrich returned from San Francisco. He brought a newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle. On the front page of the business section was an article about the exhibition. Wyoming Woman Resurrects Lost Medieval Technique. The headline read, but better than the article was what Friedrich brought in his leather case. Orders, 20 of them, from Chicago, New York, Boston, even London, 3,000 yards total, enough work for 2 years. That night, Vera stood alone in her workshop. The looms were quiet, the workers gone home. Through the windows, snow fell soft as wool, covering the muddy streets in white. She walked to the main loom, the German one Friedrich had given her. Her hands found the beams, smooth from months of use. She sat at the bench, placed her feet on the treadles. In the darkness, she still preferred darkness. For working, she began to weave. The shuttle flew back and forth. The beater bar compressed each thread. The fabric grew, black as night, but alive with possibility. Each thread was a word in a language only she could speak. Each yard was a page in a story she was writing with her hands. Sophie would arrive at dawn, eager to learn. Mrs. Chen's workers would fill the room with the hum of spinning wheels. Adelaide would manage the customers, the orders, the business of turning thread into money. But right now, in the darkness, she'd learned to love. Vera wove. The girl who'd been called trash, making treasure, the woman who couldn't hear, listening to the song her hands knew how to sing. The shuttle flew faster. The fabric grew. And somewhere in that rhythm, in that ancient dance of thread and loom, Vera smiled. She'd found her voice at last, not in words or sins, but in wool. Black wool that nobody wanted, transformed into something precious by hands that knew how to feel what others couldn't see. The snow kept falling, the loom kept singing, and Vera kept weaving, adding her thread to the great fabric of the world, one salient, perfect line at a time, connecting hearts. I told you Vera's story because my grandmother knew her, bought mourning cloth from her when Grandpa died in 1883. Grandma's fingers would trace the fabric's weave while she talked about the deaf woman who heard through her hands. She taught us something, Grandma would say, that worth isn't measured by what folks call you, but by what you create when they're not looking. And every time I feel cast aside, I remember Vera at her loom in the darkness, turning rejected wool into treasure. She didn't overcome her deafness, she made it her strength. That's the gift she left us all, knowing that our brokenness might just be where our peculiar genius lives. A note to readers. This story is a work of historical fiction inspired by the experiences of disabled craftspeople in the American frontier, created solely for entertainment purposes. This narrative does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of discrimination, violence, or harmful behavior toward any individuals. All characters and events are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The story aims to honor the resilience and creativity of those who found dignity through craft despite societal prejudice.